Nature of Society Part 4 Session 9R. Last week we began a new subject, namely physical planning, housing, infrastructure, and environmental conservation. This subject was seen as most essential for the sustainable development of communities in both the developed and developing world. The statistics regarding slum habitation percentages as of 2015 were listed for the various regions of the world, and the trends regarding slum habitation were given as follows. Global urban population had quadrupled since 1950. Cities in the developing world account for 90% of the world's urban growth. In 2007, global urban population became equal to the natural rural population. Global urban population will continue to rise and will reach 5 billion by 2030. By 2070, 70% of the global population will be city dwellers. Between 2000 and 2030, population growth in the urban areas will be 2.3% per year in the developing world. Although housing in urban centers is critical all over the world, it is particularly critical in the lesser developed countries. Here, there are inadequate housing, overcrowding, deplorable urban environments, degrading public infrastructure, outright homelessness, and unyielding poverty. You see, the session then went on to describe a new approach regarding physical planning in an SVT environment, where these undesirable trends could be satisfactorily dealt with. The aspects of this new approach include town planners and land valuators now working in concert, certificates of development potential being issued to all landowners, and the setting up of two statutory authorities, namely the Land Value Authority and the Land Value Commission, to administer and adjudicate respectively on all matters concerning this new regime. Have we thought of any of this new approach during the week? What more comments and questions do we have? We will now continue with our approach. Two authorities would have to be set up to administer the system, namely the Land Value Authority and the Land Value Commission. The Land Value Authority would list land values annually, issue correspondence to landowners, list these values in the Gazette, local newspapers, and on its website, recommend to the legislature the site value taxes in the various areas for ratification, and defend its work before the Land Value Commission should litigation with landowners arise. The Land Value Commission would adjudicate on any litigation brought before it by landowners and issue its findings, overruling, where necessary, the decisions of the Land Value Authority. It would also report to the legislature on an annual basis its findings on the work of the Land Value Authority. The legislature would take all these reports into consideration when deliberating on and ratifying site value taxes for the various sites throughout the communities. How the tax would be paid, how the lands would be distributed, and change hands would be the subject of a future session. The process would be much less complicated than it is today, and the ease with which this would be done would be the real revolution in land acquisition that most people in the community are desirous of. Once the site value tax has been approved by the legislature, landowners in possession of CPDs would now be subject to the tax. Those owners who are incommunicado, delinquent, or deceased would have their tax obligations listed in the local gazette, local newspaper, the land authorities, the website, and even on the site itself. Failure to settle the obligations would bring forth the usual enforcement procedures of payment penalties and confiscations. Those persons who are desirous of developing or redeveloping their sites will have their tax obligations suspended for a stipulated period. They will have to repay the suspended taxes prorated over time. They will have to provide valid reasons for any extensions to the suspension periods granted, and if not granted, payment penalties would apply for any time outside the granted extensions. Further details on this approach will be given in a future session. Treatment of slum areas. Environmental improvement is likely to increase output and employment in the construction trades. Many areas, now slums, have easy access to good roads and are close to amenities and work sites. Many of these slums become slums because of pollution poisoning. Pollution temperance is sure to provide many slum areas with the best stimulus to renewal there is: enhanced land values. It's taken from Economic Answers to Ecological Problems by Seymour Rauch. Slum renewal is one of the major challenges facing all countries, particularly developing countries, not only because of the expense of it, but also the logistics. Slums in the developing world are growing at a faster rate than the populations, and the impact of this on levels of crime are stark. Under SVT, slum clearance should neither be expensive or a logistical nightmare. With SVT, employment would be markedly better to the extent that those living in slums would have the wherewithal to relocate. Those persons would be decanted out and into housing that would be not as expensive as if having to establish them on greenfield sites. Those sites that are not in use in the community could be converted into housing sites without the expensive outlay for infrastructure that would be required for greenfield sites, as these would be in place already. Slum clearance could be borne on a phased basis, and the cleared spaces can be converted into high-quality urban centers, uplifting the entire city's landscape. SVT also allows the authorities to impose and enforce the highest communal standards. No longer would slum conditions be allowed to fester, and the highest building standards would be enforced when development or redevelopment is let. Persons who are in breach of this should be subject to criminal prosecution. The same would go for littering and defacing property. Nothing devalues property like these two, and the mitigation of these infractions are very lax, particularly in developing countries. To upkeep communities in this way is not only uplifting to members of the community, but also any visiting tourists, and may even be the main reason for any burgeoning tourism industry in any country. SVT applied across the country will also reverse the trend of population movements towards urban centers. There will be balanced development between urban and rural areas. All lands of value would be engaged, and the associated living centers that are attendant to these urban and rural centers will also be more amenable to the best living standards. Those lands that are required by the state for its development purposes would also be less expensive and more quickly acquired, leading to more efficient national development all around. Before we take the break, are there any questions or comments? We will now look at the treatment of infrastructure. One common phenomenon of developing countries throughout the world is poor infrastructure, poor roads and bridges, poor drainage, poor water supply and sewage disposal, and poor public transportation systems. This is as much due to poor funding, but also poor planning cultures and distinguishes developing countries from the developed ones. SVT allows countries to efficiently plan and implement adequate civil infrastructure, with everyone paying his way and having a vested interest in ensuring that the infrastructure is maintained and improved over time. Local government bodies would have direct jurisdiction and responsibility for the upkeep of their local infrastructure, excluding those pieces of infrastructure best managed by central governments, such as major highways, major waterworks, and major transportation systems. Under SVT, local governments can set and collect a portion of the tax for its infrastructure and other expenses. As each local government jurisdiction is different in nature from the other in terms of physical size, population, and economic activity, the taxes applicable would be diverse and would require negotiation and collaboration for an agreed sum to be arrived at. This sum should not go below an absolute minimum percentage of the national annual budget. Within the local government bodies, expenditure priorities should be set in conjunction and consultation with burgesses, which should be the basis of a satisfactory relationship between local government politicians and burgesses. Meetings and interactions could be set up both digitally through websites and emails, and physically through town hall meetings to ensure that interactions and feedback take place. What comments do we have on this? We now turn to national transportation. National transportation networks are another feature that sets developed countries apart from developing countries. Public transport systems can be developed that are reliable, safe, comfortable, and relatively inexpensive. This would lighten the burden considerably on the environment, the transportation infrastructure, and the level of stress on the roads in developing countries. Because this area of national life is never planned and managed, there is much chaos and confusion in most developing countries, with no prospect of improvements over time. For there to be any redemption here, a salient truth must be acknowledged, this is that transportation networks, roads, railways, airports, seaports, are all valuable to the communities. They have site values, and persons wishing to use them should pay their portion of these site values. This annual payment, borne mainly by vehicles, light and heavy trucks, cars, will bear the major part of this expenditure because they are the main beneficiaries as well as the main impactors on the transportation system. Persons using public transportation will have their share of the site value tax obligations included in their travel fares. The SVT obligations should be such that all state subsidies now become unnecessary. All uses of public infrastructure will now be free of state subsidy and should cover the annual capital cost of infrastructure, its upkeep and improvement. Rail travel, air bridge, and sea bridge travel between different locations within a country, which traditionally receive subsidy funding to provide the service, should be a thing of the past. Under SVT, there is much more wherewithal by the consumer to afford the full cost of travel. As we said earlier, under SVT, the factors of production are balanced and the cost of goods and services become affordable for all those who labor, so the need to subsidize costs are not necessary. Persons would become more discerning about all expenditures and would choose the most efficient and cost-effective good or service. The point is that all national infrastructure should be adequately funded by its users, and those who value the use of this infrastructure greatest should pay more for its use, namely the light and heavy automobile owners, the users of water, sewage disposal, electricity, telephone, garbage disposal, and street cleaning all pay directly for these services because these persons value these directly. But users of other civil infrastructure although they place great value on them, do not pay directly or not enough for them. This is why even in the developed world, civil infrastructure are badly maintained or in disrepair because of underfunding. SVT would correct this. Any comments on this proposal for national transportation and its funding? We now turn our attention to the important subject of environmental conservation. The need for environmental impact assessments, EIA, for developments being proposed would become even more essential in an SVT economy. Although sites may be deemed valuable, they should always pass the EIA tests. Valuable sites should always be amenable to developments that are desirable to the community and not be undesirable or that can potentially render any harm to it. Environmental protection should also now be of the highest priority because more development will be taking place. The need for effective garbage disposal systems, the need to monitor the effluent quality of the air and of water courses and rivers for pollutants and polluters should receive the support of the full force of law for compliance. Any anti-pollution police should be a regular feature and presence in an SVT economy, with regular inspections and testing of the environment from a technically competent and committed police force. Such industries that utilize and discharge heavy metals and other possible pollutants into our air and water courses should be robustly monitored to ensure the most stringent compliance. Those who are in breach of the anti-pollution laws should face criminal as well as civil prosecution. The other areas that would also need vigorous monitoring would be the agricultural sector for harmful use of pesticides and fertilizers, groundwater for seepage of harmful pollutants, proper disposal of sewage, supervision of quarrying operations so that water courses are not polluted, management of our forest reserves. All these go towards the conservation of our environment and must receive the highest priority. The last area of conservation that has not received the appropriate attention by anyone is the conservation of the sea. Many countries are dumping their garbage and pollutants into the sea. This is an area that needs as urgent a response from the international community as do carbon emissions. Each country should be responsible for anti-pollution programs in its exclusive economic zone and should face heavy fines and penalties from the international community for breaches. What comments do we have on this? Citizen involvement in environmental conservation. There is clear evidence that in much of the developing world, environmental conservation is observed in the breach rather than in compliance of anti-pollution laws. Citizens have tended to have passive responses to environmental impact assessments, EIA inquiries, both by their below-par attendance at such meetings and the lackluster participation when attending. In 2010, the World Bank had commissioned a survey on environmental governance in oil and natural gas industries in the developing world. Coming out of this survey were the following findings and recommendations. Firstly, EIAs should be conducted throughout the life of the project, not just before the commencement of it. Community members are only called upon to participate in them here, and the participation levels are found to be quite wanting in most cases. Because the project may pose a threat to the environment throughout its life cycle, the need for citizens to be vigilant is continuous. The monitoring authorities should also change their operations to effectively provide the technical and administrative capabilities to adequately do this. What do we think of this? The second recommendation is that the authorities should provide the call, the infrastructure, and the encouragement for community members to attend and participate in the regular public consultations or environmental impact inquiries, impact assessment inquiries. The industries must see themselves as having this to surpass the pre- and post-approval EIAs. The third recommendation from the World Bank advises that there should be a free flow and wide dissemination of environmental information and data with the possible consequences and social impacts stated publicly. This would require that all EIAs, pre and post, be published so that the public is always informed. The fourth recommendation made is that developing countries must strive for a balance between economic benefits to be had on a proposed project and the possible damage to be done to the environment in terms of air and water pollution, carbon footprint, ecological damage, spills, accidents, and fires. Countries should not only consider the economic benefits to be had. If the possibility of untoward pollution and accidents are present, enough safeguards and contingencies should be included to bring the risk to a minimum acceptable level. Environmental conservation and protection must be a collective effort from both the industries, the monitoring and enforcing regulators, the legislators, and finally the receiving public. No one entity can do this alone if there is to be success. The great outcries that we are now hearing around the world can only be treated successfully if we deal honestly and consistently with environmental conservation issues in every country of the world. What do we make of this? We will end here today, but during the week, have a look at your community and determine where environmental conservation measures are found wanting or deficient. Come back next week and discuss. Next week, we will continue our discussion on the subject. Before we end, I would like to let you attendees know that Unsustainable Development is an educational offering devoted to the dissemination of its course to all of mankind and to those who have the English language as their official language in the first instance, and to all eventually all over the world. We have in fact been sending this course all over the world, English-speaking world, with very favorable responses. To continue to make this possible, and because we do not charge a fee for this dissemination, we rely wholeheartedly on monetary donations to meet the cost of achieving these goals. If you have found these sessions useful thus far and would like others to have access to them, we would gratefully accept your donations should you be inclined to offer them. You can send donations to our PayPal account at the email address nigelgittins@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind gesture.